Hello, everybody. Welcome to the latest R-rated review of What If from Marvel Studios. Today we're looking at Episode 2, What If T'Challa Became a Star-Lord. This was one of the ones that I think was advertised pretty heavily going in, both because it's kind of a melding of two of the more popular and otherwise disconnected, segments of the MCU, and also because, obviously, the passing of Chadwick Boseman after recording his voice lines for this, but obviously before today as the episode goes live. So R.I.P. Chadwick Boseman. The actual episode of the series itself was dedicated to him in the end. I was a little surprised. I don't recall there being them doing the Wakandan salute at any point during the episode, which I was sort of expecting would show up somewhere. I might have missed it. Granted, there weren't a lot of places for it to show up in the first place, but I was a little bummed that we didn't get one more Wakandan salute there. So this is like the polar opposite of Episode 1 in terms of scope and concept and everything, really. So Episode 1, What If Sharon Carter became the first Avenger, or was the first Avenger? The Nexus event that happens there is literally just her deciding to stay not in the booth, and that changes the course of events of that program for World War II, herself and Steve, and all sorts of things like that. Episode 2, where T'Challa, I keep wanting to call him Chadwick, where T'Challa becomes Star-Lord. The Nexus event I thought was kind of hilarious. The Nexus event is Yondu just being lazy. Rather than going personally to pick up Peter Quill, he sends the Ravagers to go and do it for him. Specifically Kraglin and Taserface, which is just an interesting combo all on its own. And they mess up, and they track the most intense non-terrestrial energy signal they could find, which was the vibranium that was just everywhere in Wakanda, and they pick up T'Challa instead. As I'm thinking about this, it's like, okay, they went for the biggest source of non-terrestrial energy, but this is in 1988, and at the time, the Tesseract is on Earth. The Eye of Agamotto is on Earth. I'm trying to think if anything else is. I don't think anything else is, but 2 Infinity Stones are on Earth in 1988, and the vibranium set off a bigger signal, which is kind of interesting to me. Not set off a bigger signal, but was more easily detected, I guess. So yeah, we get some in media res, but we do hop back to 1988 to see how that went down. And we then jump forward to, quote-unquote, 20 years later. So we literally open on the episode of T'Challa going through essentially the opening sequence of Guardians of the Galaxy, but, it's T'Challa instead, which normally that movie takes place in 2014. So I guess this episode takes place in 2008. I guess that's how this is working. So a whole bunch of things happen 6 years early. A whole lot of stuff doesn't happen at all or happens completely differently. I tried to make a general list of changes because I was trying to figure out, okay, what would have to be different based on all of these things. And there's a lot of them, actually. Obviously, this takes place, 20 years after its own Nexus event, so that's going to spread wide pretty quickly, but obviously Peter Quill does not become Star-Lord. We're going to be getting into some spoilers pretty much right away for what it's worth. I recommend going and watching the episode before we get into this. There's not a lot of I just really wanted to dive in on the Nexus event itself because it's very intriguing that they were willing to go with an event 20 years to show up 20 years after a Nexus event to show just how far apart some of these timelines might become. Peter Quill doesn't become Star-Lord, and actually at the end of the episode, Ego comes and seeks him out specifically, and he's working at a Dairy Queen, and he's just mopping, he's he's just a guy working at Dairy Queen. And then the Watcher implies that this might result in the destruction of Earth, which, yeah, if Peter Quill doesn't have his friends to back him up, then I can't imagine why he would, hold back. It does beg the question. I guess he ran out of the hospital, and then his grandfather found him, and then he went on to continue living his life on Earth. I'm also intrigued and confused. So, like, oh my God, I lost my train of thought. Oh no, how does Ego even know to find him in the first place? In Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, it stated pretty much explicitly that Ego was very interested in finding Peter because he heard that his son had basically barehanded an Infinity Stone, which, yeah, that's a thing that if you're on the scale of Ego, you're going to take notice of, and that's going to be like, whoa, that's probably one of mine. But that doesn't happen here. So I guess maybe Ego is able to... I guess Ego's already able to trace his own genetic code, because he is still able to just find Peter in the actual movies also, but like, why would he care to go find... I guess he's just bored? Like, I'm just trying to figure out like what the rationale is for Ego showing up to find Peter at that point, because it didn't seem like Ego was in that much of like a rush to like find his heir quickly. Exactly. Like, in the movies, he got very excited by the fact that he had found an heir that was that powerful. And so he's like, oh, I finally have someone I can work with. But like here, there's not that. Like, that's not a thing that seems to be getting presented. So that's just kind of a confusing like piece of the puzzle. And it's weird because that's like the tiniest, most insignificant part of all of this. Is just this like throwaway little piece at the end. So, yeah, kind of interesting there. And also a neat way of showing that some of these changes are not necessarily like zero sum. Like with Captain Carter, the implication is essentially that Steve and Peggy more or less just change places, and the rest of their lives play out pretty similarly in the general sense. Like, obviously details are different, and Steve essentially becomes the Iron Giant. Like, but here we have T'Challa not only becoming Star-Lord, but actively making everyone around him a better person, whereas Peter Quill is working a dead-end job and is just kind of like, I don't know. We don't really know much about him. We don't know if he's like happy, not happy, whatever. But like Ego just shows up out of the blue and is like, "I'm your dad." Energy eyes, and you're like, "Whoa, okay, these are not even remotely like parallel tracks here." So there's that. Drax's homeworld gets saved from a Kree invasion, so he still has his wife and daughter. In the movies, it was actively Ronan that did it. So I guess at some point T'Challa has already confronted Ronan, but also Ronan sends Korath to retrieve the orb from the temple on Morag, which, why would he do that? So he's not working for Thanos, for reasons we'll get into in a second, but he's not working for Thanos. In Endgame, we found out that Ronan was the one who found the orb in the first place. He located it and told Thanos. And then Thanos, I think, basically told Ronan to go for it and also got Nebula and Gamora set up for things. But, like, Ronan is on his own right now, so it's odd that he's even looking for the orb, and he's also looking for it 6 years early. So is the idea that he's so pissed off that he got beaten by Star-Lord that he's just like, all right, I gotta get more powerful immediately, and like that's a thing? Like, it's not entirely clear. We also don't know when the Kree invasion of Drax's homeworld happened, so we don't have an idea of like how recent or far out things are. Korath and many others have heard of Star-Lord, even if they haven't met him or been directly influenced by him. And a lot of people are like big fans, as opposed to Peter Quill, who was pretty much unknown except for the cops on Xandar. And anyone who does know him are like pissed off at him. T'Challa's the exact opposite on that. Thanos, notably, gave up on his plan to decimate the universe. like not only gave up on it, but was basically talked out of it, which is incredibly bizarre. Thanos is actually like one of the main characters of this episode. He is a good guy. He's a main character. And they kind of keep doing a comedy beat of him continuing to insist in the way that you would at like a bar or like hanging out with your buds or whatever that, all right, you guys called this thing a bad idea, but it could have been a good idea. Like there's this comedy beat they keep doing where someone essentially says, hey, that sounds like genocide. And he responds with, I mean, it was efficient though. And it probably could have worked. It's such a strange bit of like, it's like this tonal tornado, and I don't know what to make of it. Sorry, there's like something in my teeth and it's driving me crazy. I'm just going to do this all the episode. That'll be great. But yeah, so Thanos has given up on his decimation plan, which means that the Black Order no longer work for him, despite the fact that he cultivated them himself. The Black Order then goes and works for Tanelier Tavan, the Collector, who has decided to fill the power vacuum in the underworld and to become essentially the kingpin of space, which is interesting because he didn't seem to have like malicious aspirations in Guardians of the Galaxy. He just seemed to be an eccentric dude who lived a long time who wanted a lot of stuff. Here he's like, I will fuck shit up to get what I want. Like, it's very interesting. So he's got, his collection is a lot more impressive as well. He has a dark elf. It might be Malekith. It's a little hard to tell because of the animation style, but it might be Malekith. And we find out later that he's actually got Malekith's dagger. He has a dark matter dagger, and he actually fights with it. So decent chance that the dark elf we see is meant to be Malekith, which is like, okay, that's an interesting direct comparison here. We've got the Collector and Malekith, and the Collector apparently won. We also, I should point out too, the bit with Ego and the comment by the Watcher that this might result in the destruction of Earth is kind of interesting, and it's a clever way of showing that the MCU, like the villains that appear in those movies, are not necessarily on a like linear progression of intensity, and that it is totally possible for Ego to be a more significant threat than Thanos. Ego being Ego, if things went differently, he could have absorbed a giant chunk of the universe, whereas Thanos getting talked down from the snap, like there's kind of an interesting comparison to get made there. So I thought that, and also the Collector and Malekith were kind of an interesting set of comparisons there. His collection also, so if Malekith is in the collection, if I don't know for sure that's him, then that means that he didn't die in the attack on London in Thor the Dark World, assuming that even happened at all, which it may not have. That's also begs the question of where the ether is, because at the end of Thor the Dark World, God, is it Volstagg? I think it's Volstagg and Lady Sif bring the ether to the Collector, and he hangs on to it all the way through Guardians of the Galaxy and into Infinity War when Thanos steals it back and destroys Nowhere. So, like, where's the ether? He also has Mjolnir in his collection. Like, he has Mjolnir and Cap's shield, and also Hela's headdress, which I guess is the means by which she summons her necro swords. So, thing one, I get why the Collector would have an interest in Mjolnir. It is Mjolnir. I don't understand why he'd have an interest in Cap's shield, especially given that the nature of vibranium seems to be a little bit lost on spacefaring folks still. So I don't entirely know. I still wish that they it's still my headcanon anyway. They never really explicitly said it, I don't think, but I've always kind of assumed that Mjolnir is also made of vibranium based on how they interacted in Avengers, and the fact that, it was a weapon forged from, like, space metal, essentially. Like, we never get those dots fully connected, but it felt that way. I don't know. So, and then there's also Hela's headdress, which I don't, helmet, I don't entirely know what to call it. It kind of looks like a helmet, I guess. But yeah, that's, I guess, the means of summoning the Necro Swords, because, like, once the Collector puts it on, he just is able to, like, just throw them around. So I guess that's what that's for. Hilariously, apparently the headdress, everyone just needs to feel themselves up a little bit when they put it on. It's just a thing you got to do. It's the way you activate it. You just have to, little Head and Shoulders commercial. I was going to say Oil of Olay. That's wrong. What's the Tresemme? That's the one I'm thinking of. Tresemme, I think, was one of the ones that had like the blatantly sexual commercials in the 2000s for shampoo. But yeah, so he has a very also there's the question. So not a lot of people know what the deal with vibranium is. So why would the Collector have Cap's shield? Cap presumably does not have a real reason to go to space, especially at that point in time. Because this is... Actually, wait, no, hang on. Double weird. This is at a point in time... Assuming they didn't completely screw up the years for this, there's... I'm going to have to go back and look again to double-check whether or not the beginning actually takes place in 1988 or not. I think it does. I'm pretty sure it does. Or... God, now I actually have to take a look at this thing. I'm going to do this while I speak. But so if this is in 2008, then that means that Cap is still in the ice. He hasn't been thawed out yet. So how would the Collector even have the opportunity to get the shield based on that? Now I need to know for sure here. And we'll figure this out. Because, like, the timeline of this is kind of odd to me. Yeah, no, Earth, Wakanda, 1988. So I don't know what happened there. It just kind of... I don't know if someone just messed up and decided not to go with the 26... Because in Guardians of the Galaxy, they're very explicit 26 years later to make it 2014. So how does he even have the shield? Because the Nexus event took place in 1988 while Cap was in the ice. So did the Collector go into the ice on Earth to take a vibranium shield? Because it's also not going to be the prototype that Tony has, because that one's an incomplete shield in 2010, which takes place after this. So I don't know. I guess that's sort of a plot hole. I'm trying to think if there's any justification for that, and I can't. And I didn't mean to like harp on this for this long. It's just kind of like, I feel like when you start doing branching timelines or multiple timelines, parallel timelines, time travel, you have to be very careful how you lay things out and what kind of references you make. Because on the one hand, he doesn't fight with Mjolnir or Cap Shield. We don't know for sure that he can actually lift Mjolnir. He probably can't, but who knows? But actually, the fact that Mjolnir is there would also imply that Thor is dead in this timeline. Because why would Thor not just do this and obtain it? So but this is also before Ragnarok happens, in the main timeline anyway. Which the Ragnarok happens because Odin dies and isn't able to hold Hela back. So would there be any reason that Odin might die like a decade earlier as a result of this? Maybe. Like, T'Challa's doing a bunch of stuff in space and is generally bettering people. It's not impossible that something that he did in space had a ripple effect and resulted in Odin dying sooner? But he hasn't been to Earth. Well, he briefly went to Earth, and Yondu lied to him. This is such a huge tangent. I'm so sorry. I feel like they kind of messed up on this one with their timeline. Like, they didn't make it quite make sense all the way through. Yeah, I don't know. Those are kind of the big ones. The Ravagers locate the orb 6 years early to save the Krylorian solar system, and Wakanda actually goes to the stars to find T'Challa. T'Chaka has kind of a brief, I wouldn't even call it argument. They just have like a mild disagreement about what Wakanda should do. T'Chaka continuing to believe in isolationism to protect his people. T'Challa, having that desire to help everyone, which carries through to the actual MCU movies. But once T'Challa is taken by the Ravagers, T'Chaka searches the stars for him. So there's the question, the two biggest questions, aside from the weird plot hole stuff, are why is Ronan looking for the orb? Because he's not working for Thanos, because Thanos is a Ravager now. And also, I'm curious if the intended end result of this, I guess there's three options. One, does Wakanda start thinking more about opening up in the way they do in the movies? Two, does Wakanda become even more isolationist? Do they become like quietly a spacefaring people while keeping the rest of Earth out of the loop? Or three, does Ego just destroy the planet and none of this even matters at that point? Hard to say. One of the biggest changes, arguably, like outside of Thanos, I would say the biggest change out of the characters we see is probably Korath. Korath, the Pursuer. I was like, what is his like title? Korath the Pursuer is like a huge Star-Lord dweeb. Like, holy cow. His character is like so far removed from how he shows up in Guardians of the Galaxy and Captain Marvel. He is like tripping over himself as a fan of T'Challa, despite the fact that he acknowledges that like he works for Ronan and Ronan wants him to take back the orb, and that means they're gonna have to fight. So they do have kind of a cute interaction where they fight, and the whole time they're both being kind of apologetic about the fact that they're fighting. They're like, "Ooh, sorry, should I not use the gun? No, use the gun, please. Just go for it." And he like lands a hit on T'Challa, and he's like, "Oh God, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to do that." He's like, No, it's fine. Go for it. Go faster. Like, don't hold back on my account," kind of thing. It's a very interesting scene and probably one of my favorites in the episode, just because it's such an like interesting twist on all of this stuff. T'Challa actually offers Korath to join the Ravagers, which is like, I kind of got to do this right now. But after they fight, T'Challa wins, knocks out Korath, and just kind of like throws him up over his shoulders, like, all right, here we go. But like Korath does join the Ravagers. He feels like comic relief in the episode, which is already so out of character for like such a stone-faced like person normally, but also the Ravagers in general are much more lighthearted. They're taking their inspiration from Robin Hood, of like they're kind of being the equalizers. They steal from the rich, give to the poor. And so the Ravagers, which were already kind of a dark humor sort of group in the first place, we now have Kraglin, who is very much 100% comic relief. We have Thanos, who is super duper neutered. He's a little dark at times, but he's like just charming, affable, fun guy. We've got Kraglin, who is Kraglin. Like, he's, I guess, pretty accurate to his character in Guardians, but he was already kind of a hard to take seriously guy. We have Taserface, who is also very like cartoonish, for lack of a better term, compared to his normal self. We also have female Ravager. She does not get a name. She gets exactly one line. I don't entirely know why she's there. It feels like they just kind of went, yeah, let's just throw her in. We won't make her useful. I don't know if she actually, does she even go on the mission? I'm not even sure if she goes on the main mission. Like, she might just be at the bar and then is gone. It's such a weird inclusion. Yeah, I don't know. But Korath feels incredibly far out of character. T'Challa feels mostly in character. He seems like just a smarmier version of himself, like a little cockier, a little bit more, not biting with his humor, but he's a little bit more It's less dry wit and more sharp wit, I would say. It's still dry, but it's not as dry. He has this overwhelmingly positive attitude. He makes everybody around him better. Obviously, he talks Thanos out of pursuing the Infinity Stones. So the Infinity War straight up will not happen in this timeline. It hasn't had a chance to happen yet, because that takes place literally a decade later normally, but it's just not going to happen in this timeline unless something really absurd happens to Thanos. So that's a whole thing. Yondu is openly very supportive of T'Challa, doesn't seem to have any interest in eating or threatening to eat him, which for Peter, they threatened that apparently a ton. The Ravagers are way more of like a family here, even more so. Like they were pretty well like a Band of Brothers style situation in the movies, but here there is basically, it also seems like a very small crew. I don't know if it's just like they're the main chunk, like they are Yondu and his closest associates as opposed to the entirety of the Ravagers, but it kind of seems like that's the case. There's also the question of whether Yondu is still an outcast from the Ravagers, which he was in Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. Because I would think a lot of the goodwill that he has been helping spread would do a lot to get him back into people's good graces, with like Stakar and the rest of the Ravagers, I guess. This has been very wandery. It's kind of tough. I have a lot of like separate thoughts. They're all kind of character related, more so than the plot. The plot is ultimately pretty. I wouldn't say it's super basic. We'll get there in a sec. Thanos is just weird overall to me in this. And I need to talk about animation, the art style, and voice acting at this point. So Thanos first appears, and I'm like, oh, wow. So I guess they didn't even bother to try to get Josh Brolin back for this. And then I looked later, I was like, oh, that is him. Oh, wow. I get that, like, part of the reason Thanos has that really low, dry, threatening sort of tone to his voice. I'm even still being a little bit too high-pitched. He had some energy to him, but he always sounded a little bit tired. Not even close to an accurate representation, but, like, here he's more chipper, more upbeat, higher pitched voice. It sounds like somebody else entirely, even though it's him. Taylor Tavan is still voiced by Benicio del Toro, but his accent sounds entirely different, like so far off. Thanos has a very weird looking face. Like, I know that the cell shading they're doing is doing some interesting seams on people in general, but like, it looks like, because he's got the kind of the butt chin, as everyone's calling it, it's ridged, so there's like really hard lines because there's basically always strong shadow there. So it just looks weird to me in this art style. And like the lip flaps throughout this episode are also really off. Like, they don't have to be perfect. There's only so much you can do about that without needing like 100 frames a second to make it, comprehensible. But there were times where it's like, someone's like, mom, and they're like, oh, yeah, we can go over there tomorrow. And it's like, like, oh, okay, that wasn't even close, but okay. There's a oneer that we get near the end of the episode that's this, like, sideways, just panning shot of kind of I had the word and I lost it. It starts with an R, but it basically means like a big gathering with food and things. I was going to say reception, maybe reception. I don't know. Essentially just like a big kind of gathering. Not quite a party, but the Ravagers and the Wakandans are kind of meeting for the first time and like all revelry and drinking food and stuff. It's not like a full party again, but as they're passing through, you get little tiny vignettes with a couple people at a time. But it's weird because the moment you're done with a little segment, so the very first one is Thanos talking with someone from Wakanda about his plan, and they're like, it sounds kind of like genocide. It's like, it's efficient. And then Nebula, who was also here, is like, oh, Dad. And then everyone just kind of freezes in place as it keeps. And then the next chunk, which was frozen, suddenly pops to life and animates. And it's like, I don't know. It looks weird and it feels a little jarring when the animation stops and starts like that. And there's 3 or 4 of those in a row in that one shot. So that's the voice acting in general felt really off in this episode. Like, it felt very out of character in a lot of ways. And I know the idea is that they are going for new spins on the characters, but like the voice texture, I guess, of each of them is very different. We'll get to Nebula in a second. Nebula might be the most different of all of them. I would say Chadwick Boseman for T'Challa, John Kani for T'Chaka, and maybe Chris Sullivan, the guy who does Taserface. They're like the only ones who sound on model, basically, for this whole episode. And even Taserface, who is even more of a comic relief than he is in Guardians 2, yeah, like, I don't know. It's hard to... Everybody feels off in varying ways. Drax was not voiced by Dave Bautista for this. They got... I'm going to pronounce his name wrong. Fred Tatasciore, who helped... So, I'm going to say it and then explain it. He helped voice the Hulk and the Abomination in The Incredible Hulk. And to explain that, both of those characters, their like roars and grunts and speech patterns and things were all done as like mixtures of a couple different people. I don't know that Ed Norton actually did anything for the voice of the Hulk, whereas nowadays Mark Ruffalo, well, nowadays is Professor Hulk, but when the Hulk was still like his own thing, Mark Ruffalo would at least partially voice the Hulk. And I don't know if Lou Ferrigno was still assisting on that up through until Thor Ragnarok, and I guess into Infinity War. But yeah, so Drax was not voiced by Dave Bautista. Someone was actually asking him about that on Twitter. It was like, "Hey, how come you're not voicing Drax for What If?" And his pretty curt response was, "Disney didn't ask me to." I was like, "Well, fair. I do kind of wish that they brought him in. I'm sure this is not to excuse the decision, but I'm sure it's got something to do with union requirements, essentially, of like how much you have to pay someone for a day's work, and days of work are always rounded up. So coming in to voice, 30 seconds of dialogue is a full day's work. This is my understanding of things. I'm not an expert on this, and I have no idea if SAG covers voice acting the same way, but this is my assumption of how things went down, because Peter Quill is also not voiced by Chris Pratt. He's voiced by Brian T. Delaney, who I didn't write down other stuff that he had done for voice acting work. Go me. That was good. I did write down that we got the voice of I was gonna say fan favorite, show favorite voice actor, I guess. Jeff is a big fan of Dave Boat, who we've seen recently in the credits of Kingdom Hearts Birth by Sleep. He voices Aelius. He also voices Lexius in Chain of Memories. But Dave Boat was one that Jeff got a good chuckle out of, and he apparently voices somebody. He's under additional voices for this episode, so maybe he's in like the crowds or something. But yeah, so Thanos, I'm going to swing back around to Thanos. Thanos feels a little weird to me because he's so just kind of casually like, yeah, I'm pretty good now. And like, I understand that the idea is that they're trying to get at the notion that T'Challa is just so damn good that he can even talk down Thanos, which is, yeah, a really cool, like, informed ability sort of thing. But it also just feels like such a stretch when dealing with Thanos. Like, he does not seem like the talk me down type. Like, he was one of those dudes in Infinity War who, like, a lot of people were arguing with him about it, and he was like, nope, I already decided this is how it's going to go. This is just how it's going to go. So I'd be curious to know how that discussion even went in the first place. It sounded like the idea was, rather than just like deleting half the universe's life forms, he opted to like spread the resources of the universe more evenly, and that was the solution, but we don't get like a full-on confirmation there. Nebula shows up. At first I thought she was wearing a blonde wig because she's got this kind of like pulp look to her. She's got like a 50s pulp detective like, that's when she walked in, the one with the gams, like that like that's kind of the general look that she's got when she first appears, but she's got like blonde hair and she's got it covering her cybernetic eye. So she's clearly been still experimented on and tortured by Thanos. They're not on great terms, but the change of heart that Thanos has results in him releasing Nebula. She looks nothing like she does in the movies, and she sounds very little like it too. It is still, I believe, Karen Gillan voicing Nebula, but she has a very different cadence to her voice than she does in the movies. Now, granted, like, so she is Scottish, if I remember correctly, and like a lot of Scottish folks can pull off really solid American accents, you know, in the first place. I don't know, I don't know if she just got like a different like region sounding thing going on there or what, but it just sounds a little weird. Also, her face shape is very different. Like, Karen Gillan has a pretty circular face, I would say, and here it's like whoop, like a tall head, and the hair makes it look even taller. And I'm just like, this like feels like a different character entirely. It feels like they wanted to go for a version of the character that just looks more like the comics, which I guess is fine, but it's just like, I don't know, it's a little bit strange. She also just kind of generally sounds more human. Like, she's way more casual, emotive, jokey in a lot of ways. Her nickname for T'Challa is Cha-Cha, which I think is adorable. Also, where is Gamora? And better question, who is Gamora? And better question, why is Gamora? We don't hear anything about Gamora in this episode. Now, we see Drax. He's a bartender and you know, not involved in any of this beyond that. And Nebula is here doing this. Peter is back on Earth. Rocket and Groot are presumably still just basically bounty hunters, just doing their thing. But Gamora, like, I don't understand what Gamora is up to. Yeah, maybe she went back to her planet, which was half dead, half killed. I don't know, but we don't even hear about her at all, which was a very interesting thing to happen here, especially given the main MCU already has a second Gamora anyway. So, not a second one, I guess a new Gamora, a new old Gamora after the old Gamora was killed. We have another one from a different timeline. I have wandered so much, and this episode is definitely not going to be as good as my first one, so great. The overall plot revolves around essentially Nebula gives T'Challa word of this thing called the Embers of Genesis. Yeah, the Embers of Genesis, which are a thing. They describe it as like dust from a, oh boy, if I could find it. It was dust of, nutrient-rich dust from an ancient supernova, and it has the ability to terraform whole planets. And they are going to steal it from the Collector, who, in this timeline, as I said, is now like this massive underworld kingpin style dude. And they go to do it. She double crosses them when they split up. But then it turns out to be a triple cross because this was a distraction so T'Challa could go and do the thing separately from everybody. The plot is okay. I would say it's a little bit weak. It's better from the first episode in the sense that it's not kind of just retreading old ground. But I would say that this is not a particularly compelling plot. And we wind up with a fight with the Collector where he's just kind of got stuff from throughout the MCU, basically, which I guess makes sense for this series where it's like it's going to keep being referential, but it also just feels kind of like, look at all this shit that I've got. Now I'm going to fight you with the tiniest knife. Like, it was weird. Oh, he also cuts off, we don't know for sure that it's him, but it sure seems to be strongly implied that he cut off Korg's arm. It kind of sounds like it kind of seems like Ragnarok happened like a decade early, and the Collector went and fucked everybody up Thor, Hela, Korg, everybody. There's other weapons there that I didn't recognize, so those might have been other things as well. But so that was kind of a haunting thing there, and he's like using it to like punch and guard and stuff too. But yeah, they fight, and then like T'Challa winds up. Well, before they fight, T'Challa winds up in one of the exhibit cages. He gets knocked out and thrown into one of the boxes, and then he is able to get out because he's got a Wakandan necklace that's, I think, made of vibranium, so he can punch through the glass with it. He basically makes a set of like basically iron knuckles essentially to crack through. It's similar to the idea of the little when you're in a car and they sell them. I don't know how to describe them, but the idea is they'll usually have one part that's got a knife and a slit, so you can cut a seatbelt. It's basically a survival tool for if you crash your car into a lake. You can cut your seatbelt with a blade that's kind of hidden inside, and then the other side has a trigger-mounted thing that you put up against your window and then pull, and it's this like stainless steel. It almost looks like a how do I even describe this? It's like a big pyramid-y point. I don't know. It reminds me of like a soldering iron or a hot glue gun or one of those, just like a metal point, and it hits the window with enough force that it shatters it. And that's what that reminded me of. Great tangent, Rick. But they fight, and Tavon gets knocked into his own box, and then while he was in the box before, he argues with Tavon about like, yeah, history doesn't look so well on people who put other people in cages, which is true, yeah. And Karina, the assistant, hears this, and the slave basically of the collector, and is the one who is given the controls to all the boxes at the end. She sicks all the exhibits on the collector, who is presumably killed off camera. We do get to see more. We get to see and hear more of the collection than I think we'd seen in the movies. Oh boy, I had a list of them and they're gone. There's Elvish literature. There's Cronins, which Korg is a member of that race. We got more conversation with Howard the Duck, who, man, oh man, I forgot that he was voiced by Seth Green because I couldn't quite unhear Chris Griffin in his voice. It was hard to separate in my head. There's a cute moment early on where Yondu confuses Robin Hood for Robin Leach, which is doubly funny since Robin Leach was the host of Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous, which feels like the polar opposite of what Robin Hood would be doing. Korath tries to kneel or bow to T'Challa, and he says, oh, that's not necessary, which is a nice little wink back to, I think, Infinity War, when they arrive in Wakanda. And I think, is it Bruce? That's all like, oh, what do I do? I think it was Bruce. I might be wrong. Howard the Duck says, when you're out of luck, always go duck, which is a weird implication sentence for a lot of reasons, and also feels like an offhanded Down and Dirty Duck reference, even though I know it is not, but my brain jumped there immediately, and I was like, oh boy, there's no way that that's accurate, but good lord. Yeah. Thanos fights the Black Order, but he needs, I think, Nebula's help in order to actually like deal with them for good. And she uses the Embers of Genesis on, was it Cull Obsidian, I think? It goes in his mouth, and he basically explodes into a giant like plant thing. They leave nowhere. Nowhere is very quickly being terraformed. And that's that. I would say... Oh, there was also a cute little thing. This doesn't, like, I'm kind of already in like this random thoughts category, but I don't know if it's how they pilot the ship, but where T'Challa is sitting at the end of the episode in the Ravager ship is just this little circular platform, and he's just kind of sitting cross-legged doing one of these, and it's just kind of a nice, like, cool, just thought design thing in general. When the Collector gets swarmed, he goes, "Oh, karma," which is maybe a little on the nose. I don't know. I'm also curious about the Embers of Genesis in general, because this is, I think, the first major thing so far that has shown up in What If that is not anywhere in the MCU otherwise. So I'm curious if this is our sneak peek ahead of time that the Embers of Genesis are going to be a thing that appear in one of the later movies. Maybe Thor 4. Maybe they're going to build a new Asgard. It could be... I don't even know. I'm trying to think of like what else could even be used for that. There's not a lot of planets that are outright destroyed in the MCU. It could be actually... it's probably going to be a thing that gets used to build a new Skrull homeworld, right? Because wasn't their homeworld destroyed by the Kree? So maybe that's the idea. They're going to come back. Maybe it'll be in Secret Wars, and that'll be like the way that the Skrull get a new homeworld. The Skrull are definitely the butt of a joke early on too. That's like, always good to hurt a Skrull, and it's like, oof. Granted, I think Yondu, the one who says that, was sold into Kree slavery as a child. So even though he, was essentially child labor for the Kree, it's not entirely surprising that he would grow up with that kind of indoctrination about the Skrull going on or something. I don't know. So some comparisons with the first episode. This was a much larger deviation from the sacred timeline than episode 1 was. Though granted, this takes place 20 years after its Nexus event, as compared to Captain Carter, which was like a couple months, and then 2012, obviously, for a brief moment, or what we assume is 2012 anyway. So like it's an understandable difference, but it does feel like much more of a like, let's just go wherever with this. T'Challa's Star-Lord, go. And we did wind up with a few apparent plot holes as a result. There may be a reason why Captain America's shield is there. That's probably the most obvious plot hole thing that's going on here. So there's that. The voice acting was still rough. I would say arguably worse. Maybe not worse. I think that the worse voice acting in episode 1 was worse than the worse voice acting in episode 2. But I would say that overall, episode 2 generally had worse voice acting. It's not a great bar to be setting. I'll just put it that way. The animation had a lot of stiffness to it. Again, I would say that this one generally felt better, but again, the worst moments just kind of stuck out a bit more. It felt a little bit more random with its cameos and its references and things, especially with the collection. I still don't understand how that shield made it to Vaughn. That's going to be killing me for the rest of this show. There's also fewer like real parallels with the main MCU, whereas episode 1 seemed to have a lot of them. This one didn't really have so many. The only ones that come to mind are Yondu lied, Karina gets revenge on Vaughn. That might be it. Yeah, that might be it. Yeah. Yondu gets to meet T'Chaka, so he actually gets to meet his adopted son's birth father. Though, granted, I guess he also met Ego, so I don't know. I don't know. I feel like this episode was generally not quite as good as the first one. And maybe that's because I'm expecting too much for it to be, hey, here's how some things in the MCU could have been different, which episode 1 did, as opposed to this one where it's like, hey, let's put this one deviation in, and where does this go? Holy shit, it's totally different now. Like, maybe I'm expecting it too much to be similar to the MCU as opposed to a complete deviation. I thought the episode was okay overall. It didn't really do it for me all that much. Thanos and Nebula were so weirdly different from their normal selves that it was kind of hard to ignore. The whole, I got talked out of it thing was incredibly strange. Yeah, I don't know. I think that's an extension of the idea that T'Challa is just such a force for good and for, helping raise up others, to be their best selves, that like that's what they're going for. It does feel like it's maybe getting extended a bit too far, is I guess where I'm going with that. Oh boy, I think I'm gonna give this episode a 5. It was not a bad episode, but it definitely had a lot more stumbling points, I think, than the others. It felt a little bit less structured. Not structured. It felt a little bit less. It felt like there was less attention paid to details in this one than in the previous one, I guess is kind of one of the major differences here. Yeah. I don't know. Like I'm still kind of ruminating on it. Gonna let that cogitate. Other words. But I would love to hear what you guys think about this video. I got a few ideas as to whether or not this was a good video or not. I would love to hear what you guys think about what if T'Challa became a Star-Lord as well. Apparently this season will only have 9 episodes. I thought it was 10, but it will be 9. And so we'll see what some of the other ones are. I am going to take a guess that the next one is going to be, just kind of thinking about the ones that we know are in here, I'm going to bet that the next one is what if Spider-Man became the Sorcerer Supreme. Sorcerer Supreme. There we go. Perfect. Yeah, Sorcerer Spider-Man. Let's go with that. Thank you guys very much for watching. Hopefully this was not too much of a completely confusing mess. I'll catch you guys next time. See you next week. Bye.